there really was a worldwide flood, what would the evidence be? Billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down the water all over the earth. Billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down the water all over the earth. Well, there really was a worldwide flood.
Welcome to Creation Foundation, where we discuss the biblical worldview and why it is the most logical worldview when you compare it with what we see in reality. I'm Dick Temple.
I'm Mark Finkbeiner.
And I'm Greg Morgan.
Today we're going to discuss irreducible complexity. This is a term made popular by Michael Denton, who teaches at a university in New Zealand. What it boils down to is that biological systems are so complex that even if there were mechanisms to cause them to change from one form to another, there are so many things would have to happen at once that by the laws of probability, it's totally impossible for such a thing to happen. Now, Michael used a illustration of a mousetrap. And what he said is there's 5 moving parts to a mousetrap. If you have any one of those parts is missing, the mousetrap won't work. So that to build a mousetrap, all 5 parts have to come together at the same time. The designer, of course, makes the mousetrap. In biological systems, to try to get all the various components to make a biological system function requires far more than 5 parts. Now, on this program, we'd like to cause you to do some thinking. And so I'd like you to think about, first of all, illogic. You know, someone came to me and said, hey, they've made a mousetrap that only has 3 moving parts. That proves that evolution is possible. Really? What that is a mousetrap. We've got it reduced to three parts, but biological systems, we haven't reduced the number of components to make them work. So irreducible complexity is something that is a real problem for those who want to hang on to the belief in evolution. So Mark, what do you have for us here today?
I just want to start out with a Bible verse here in 1 Corinthians 1:27. This is my favorite verse. But God hath chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise, and God hath chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty. And that goes along with irreducible complexity and the fact that you can't get more out of something than what you put into it. You know, the evolutionists, I've heard them say, well, a good evidence for evolution is look at the advances in technology that we have today. You know, with the computers, our communication system, with laser beams and laser beam guided missiles and satellites and astronomy, all the things that we're doing up in space. You know, they would say, look at all of this that we're doing and technology is advancing. Well, I want to tell you that Newton's third law says that for every action there is an opposite and equal reaction. And in the same thing in technology, there's also the downside to it, okay? And for example, ever since we got the internet, got computers, people's identity is being stolen, people's credit cards are being stolen, so you have that problem. For every action, for every advancement in technology, there is a downside to it. And one thing I've noticed is that since technology has been advancing more and more, guess what? There's more frustration, there's more impatience. You know, I can remember the time when we didn't hardly have any freeways and you never heard of road rage. Well, we get freeways, people can drive faster now and people can drive safer, and guess what? Now we have road rage. I mean, you would think that with all the advancement in technology, we would be solving all the problems that we're seeing in this world, but as technology seems to advance, the more problems we're having. The more wars we're having, the more violence we're having. We're pouring more and more money into our public school system, and still there's more school shootings than ever. You know, we're not taking care of our problems through the advancement of technology. And so God, He uses the foolish things of the world, or the weak things, to confound the mighty. Okay? And so what I want to really talk about today is Newton's third law of motion, Lenz's law, and the first and second law of thermodynamics, in reference to irreducible complexity, that you cannot get more out of something than what you put into it. And you see, evolution claims that, billions of years ago we had this pond and it had pond soup in it, and then we had a lightning bolt. The lightning bolt struck the pond soup, and from the pond soup we get this single cell organism, and from that single cell organism everything just kept getting more complex and more complex through the billions of years. Well, I want you to know that violates many laws of science, not to mention the first law of thermodynamics, the second law of thermodynamics, and believe it or not, even when we get into electricity, it violates the laws of electromagnetic induction. It violates Newton's third law of motion, okay? Before I begin, I think this is really interesting here. In Job 38:22 it says, "Hast thou entered into the treasures of the snow? Or hast thou seen the treasures of the hail?" We never even knew what that verse meant until the invention of the microscope, and we put these snowflakes under the microscope, and you know what we found out? We found that there are no two snowflakes that are the same, and every snowflake is six-sided, and we see marvelous complexity in a snowflake. We see design in snowflakes. The Bible is way ahead of science. And so here we see awesome examples of design as you see these pictures here on the screen of snowflakes. Well, with that in mind, let's talk about the laws of nature, or the laws of science. We have the first law of thermodynamics, which says that basically you can't get something from nothing. Nothing can be created or destroyed, okay? And the second law says that everything is going from order to disorder. All right, well, evolution, it violates those laws. So let's talk more about the laws of nature. Laws of nature, they are precise statements based on discoveries through observation and experiment that have been repeatedly verified and never contradicted. Okay, never contradicted. And so here's how to refute false ideas in science. Let's talk about mathematics, okay? As you see on your screen, you see this algebra equation here. Now, by looking at this equation, you can see that this is false because a law in mathematics has been violated, all right? But then you take a look at this equation, and you can see that this equation is correct because a law in mathematics has not been violated. So we can say that this equation that you're looking at, it is correct because it is balanced. It is equal on both sides of the equation. When we look at nature, we see that everything has been balanced out, and it has been the sin nature of man that has caused an imbalance to come into nature and cause things to wear out, hence the second law of thermodynamics. Now, how to refute false ideas of chemistry. You'll notice this equation, this chemistry equation here, it is unbalanced, all right? It is not equal, all right, on both sides of the equation. Now we take a look at this equation. You will notice it is now balanced. It is equal on both sides, okay? It has to be equal on both sides of the equation in order for it to be balanced. All right? So we know that that top equation is false because a law of stoichiometry has been violated. All right? Now take a look at this picture. Here's a picture that shows water. Okay, it's the best picture I could find. Water flowing up a hill, flowing up a mountain. Now, is this a false idea? Well, actually it is, because in physics, water cannot run uphill because a law in nature has been violated. It is the law of energy of conservation that has been violated. So we know that water cannot flow uphill. Now let's take a look at a law in biology. In biology, we are taught that man has evolved from a long, continuous process called evolution. Now, is this true? Well, it is false because a law has been violated. Well, is there such a law? Yes, there is. The law of biogenesis was attributed to Louis Pasteur, and it states that life can only arise from pre-existing life. Okay? Evolution teaches that life can come from nothing. All right? That you can actually get something from nothing, which violates the first law of thermodynamics. Okay? So therefore, we can conclude that the belief in evolution is not scientific. It is an incorrect belief. It is a false idea. Now take a look at these two robots. You will notice that each one has 8 legs, okay? And these robots, they can go forwards, they can go backwards, they can climb over things, all right? But these robots have a computer built into them. They have a memory built into them. It has information, all right? Now with that in mind, let's take this robot and let's weigh it. Let's put it on a scale, okay? Let's just say it weighs, a certain amount of pounds, all right? Now we take the robot and we hit the delete button in the computer so that it erases all the information, okay? So now what happens to the robot? Well, the robot can't move anymore because it has no information. The information is gone, all right? So let's put that robot back on the scale. With the information deleted, is that robot going to weigh more, the same, or less? Well, we can say for a fact that it will weigh the same. Here is the point. The point is that information is not material, okay? It is not something that you can see, touch, or taste, or feel, anything like that, all right? So the question is, if it is not material, and evolution claims to have evolved material over millions of years, then where did the information come from? Because after all, evolution cannot develop something that you can't see. I mean, it only claims that it can create matter. But how did it create the information? And where did the energy come from to create the information? And where did the information come to create the energy? You see, you have to have it all at once, otherwise you don't have it at all. Okay? And so 2 kinds of laws of nature. There are material entities, which is energy, power, and electricity. And then you have non-material entities, which is information and consciousness. And evolution cannot explain where that information came from, how it got there, or consciousness in a human being. Okay, so here we have the first law of thermodynamics. The first law of thermodynamics says that nothing can be created or destroyed. You cannot get something from nothing. All right, you can't get more power than what you put into it. So therefore, if the universe was not created by natural means, in other words, evolution, then it had to be created supernaturally. This is why the Bible says in Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. So what God did is He created the elements. All right, He created the elements. And you know, if you've taken chemistry, you've seen the periodic table of elements, okay? Now, I've done a lot of research in this, and it's kind of funny because not even the scientists really know how many elements that are on the periodic table of elements. One high-profile chemistry website said 118 elements, another one said 115 elements, but there's a debate if there was actually 91 or 92 natural elements, okay? Now, get this. Every living thing on this planet, everything is made up of these elements. So the evolutionist comes along and says, well, see, we all evolved from the same source, so that's why everything is made up of the same elements, okay? Well, here's the problem. There's another way to look at this. It could be that God, what He did in the beginning, He created all these elements, and these elements are made up of an atom. In the Greek, the word atom comes from atomos. Okay, so it's a Greek word, and it means that which cannot be divided further, all right? So in the periodic table of elements, that is what everything is made of. Now, human beings have synthesized plutonium and neptunium and a bunch of other elements from a laboratory, especially down there in Berkeley University, okay? Well, guess what? They did not make those elements from nothing. They had to start with another element like uranium and create the plutonium, okay? So there again, you have to start with something in order to create something else. But when you create something else, you don't get more than what you started out with. Okay?
Okay, well, one of the things I get out of this is It would be a good idea if you showed up at his science clubs where you can pick his brain and ask him questions in person, because there's a lot you can learn from this guy. One thing I found fascinating was you're talking about electricity creating life. Where this came from is really fascinated me. Luigi Galvani found out that by applying electricity to a recently killed frog's nerves, he could cause it to move. He showed that to a lady who looked at it and thought about, wonder if we could make electricity cause a stillborn child to come back to life. As she thought about this, she developed the story of Frankenstein, Frankenstein's monster who came back to life because of electricity. So when we read our books about evolution and where life come from, usually we get the fictional idea of an electric spark on the elements that were all put together, bringing things back to life. It really came from Frankenstein's monster. So some of the history of evolution is absolutely amazing. Now, as we get into another phase of irreducible complexity, and where we see irreducible complexity in animals, I'd like to turn this over to Greg Morgan.
First, there are at least 94 natural elements, because it turns out plutonium is found in very minute quantities in the uranium ore pitch blend. And that's the 94th element on the periodic table. So, and it decays in many ways. But there are at least 94 of them that are natural, and that was not known at the time that Glenn Seaborg got a Nobel Prize for creating what they thought was the first plutonium ever created on the planet. It's interesting how science goes by leaps and bounds, but also by leaps backward. An interesting way to apply some of these laws also, I like the way Russ Miller describes how you can disprove evolution. He says that he can disprove evolution in 11 seconds. The genome barrier plus random mutations plus natural selection equals evolution is impossible. Not sure if I spoke quite as quickly as he did, but we could go for hours discussing what all these terms mean, but it is just that simple. In 11 seconds, you can prove that evolution is impossible. So I'd like everyone to engage your brains, and those of you who would like to see a miracle, watch this little video clip. You see the miracle? Each time a giraffe bends its neck down, there's a miracle because that giraffe does not die, and lowering its neck should kill the giraffe. Each time the giraffe raises its neck back up, it doesn't faint, and that's another miracle. The giraffe should be unable to do that because the giraffe, being 13 feet tall, has to have the largest heart of all the land animals. And that heart is producing so much blood pressure in order to pump it all the way up that head that the blood pressure in the heart and in the arteries near the heart is extremely high. By the time it gets up through that 13 feet to the brain, it's at a reasonable blood pressure. But when the giraffe turns its head down, just the difference in height means that the blood pressure is increasing. And by the time it got down low enough to eat, all of the little tiny blood vessels in the brain should rupture. So why don't they? Well, because there's a valve in the neck, just about here, and only the blood that's downstream from that actually goes into the head when it lowers its head. But that valve isn't strong enough. It couldn't resist all this blood. So there's another one, and another, and another. And each one stops a certain amount of the blood from flowing down. But it's not enough just to stop this blood, because there is this final little bit of blood that's flowing from here, and that would be enough to cause serious damage to the brain. So, around the brain, there is a spongy material, and as the blood flows down here, it flows into the spongy material. the spongy material fills up with blood, the brain continues to have the appropriate amount of blood, perfectly balanced. Now, how could it possibly have evolved that way? Darwin thought that giraffes came about because antelopes walking around on the African plain were having to stretch up to get food, and that stretched neck was passed down to their children. Well, it turns out that idea is false. It's called Lamarckianism now, and it's false. But even if it were somehow true, the stretch might get there, but nothing would create those valves. Those valves have to be there, or the first giraffe would have died. And go into some other things that have to be there. The spongy material has to be there for the first giraffe. But also, when the giraffe stands back up, now all that blood begins draining out from the head and draining back down. And when we lose blood in our brain, we faint. Giraffe would too, except that spongy material was now a source of blood, and it flows back from the spongy material into the brain, and it keeps the brain supplied with blood during that critical few moments when it's first stood up. Those valves then open back up, and blood flow begins going again. If a giraffe stood up and fainted, lions nearby would probably come over and eat it before it recovered. This sort of thing is something that is the several valves, the spongy material, and the balance, so that spongy material is just the right size for the blood, and the spongy material forces it back into the brain. All of that has to be there for the first giraffe, or that first giraffe dies. So believing that a giraffe could evolve is certainly not scientific. It violates several laws, and there's really no reason to believe that a giraffe could evolve. But there are lots of other animals that demonstrate that. Here we've got Incredible Creatures That Defy Evolution. It's a nice DVD. Job Martin has it. And that wasn't enough, so we put Incredible Creatures 2 and Incredible Creatures That Defy Evolution 3. Lots of examples. For now, I'd like to talk about an example of a golden plover. Golden plover is a small shorebird. If you've seen killdeer, you've seen something fairly similar to it. But the golden plover nests in Alaska. And just like other birds, it mates, it has eggs which hatch out into chicks. It raises the chicks until they're about ready to fly. And the golden plover parents then fly to southern Alaska to a feeding ground where there's a lot of shellfish. And they spend a few weeks there eating like mad until they actually have 55% body fat. 55% of their weight is fat. And at that point, they stop eating, they shut down their digestive system, and the stomach shrinks. It's basically, it is absorbed into the bloodstream and put back out and is stored as more fat. Everything to do with digestion, including the liver, is reduced in size, and the energy that was in that is stored as fat. The plover then gets together in clouds of them, and they fly south from southern Alaska. And this is a shorebird that cannot swim. Where's it headed? Hawaii. Now, with the fat that it has, it's able to get about 2/3 of the way there, except though the liver and the stomach have also been converted into fat, which gives it enough to fly almost all the way there. But it still can't get there unless it flies in a flock in V formations, much like geese fly. As they fly in a V formation, the first one is using up a lot of energy. The second one is able to take advantage of the slipstream from this one and has less energy needs. And they fly for a while this way, and then this one falls back, and another one takes over in the lead. And that gives them just enough range to get to Hawaii. And all of those things have to be there in place at one time, or the thing doesn't work. The other thing is that the chicks come down to southern Alaska a few weeks later, and then they fly to Hawaii using the same method, and they've never been to Hawaii. How do they find Hawaii? It's built into their genetic code, and that had to be there from day one. And there are at least 7 different ways that if they were missing one thing, they would all die. And all of them have to be there. So that is an incredibly complex thing. It is irreducible complexity in that golden plover, and that's just for describing the migration. If you look at their cells, it's even more so.
I was just looking at the function of the pituitary gland this week. The numbers of hormones that are produced by the pituitary gland, they regulate bone growth, they regulate reproduction, they regulate childbirth, they regulate lactation. In fact, the prolactin, which regulates lactation, actually regulates a total of just over 300 different things that go on in the body. And that's a hormone that goes out through the bloodstream to the rest of the body. You talk about something complex.
Dick, isn't it true that you have to have DNA to make proteins, but you have to have proteins in order to have DNA?
That's true. That's right back to your original irreducible complexity. Like the mousetrap having to have all the parts before it'll catch a mouse. And the DNA in humans consists of about 3 billion base pairs. So there's 3 billion different units of 2 going all the way down this chain. But for the DNA to work, it has to have messenger RNA come and read the code and then take the code out to the enzymes to produce the various proteins, which are the building blocks of the biological system. How are you going to put all of those things together into one organism that functions when everything has to work at once? Truly, life is irreducibly complex. You know, just because you can make a mousetrap with only 3 movable parts only is an example of the fact you have to have 3 movable parts all together at one time so that the mousetrap will work. But with biological systems, even the simplest bacteria has to have so many interacting proteins, enzymes, etc., all operating together, that life cannot possibly occur on its own without intelligent design behind it.
I actually did that calculation for how many times you'd have to try to produce a DNA molecule. And for the smallest DNA molecule that I was aware of at the time, that of the tobacco mosaic virus, if you took one that was 1/10 that long, the probability of that arising by chance is less than 2 chances in 10 to the 843rd power. Now, that's really small. The reason that I did that calculation was that I had heard on Liberty Radio that an atheist named Sir Fred Hoyle had done a calculation for how probable it is life can come from non-life. And that he had concluded there was 1 chance in 10 to the 40,000th power. He said, we may conclude that life on this earth was created by some vast intelligence, and that intelligence may, for want of a better word, be called God. Now from there he goes on to define his own version of God, a non-living intelligence, and I do not believe in non-living intelligences. But there you've got Sir Fred Hoyle, theoretically the best scientist in the British Empire, and a colleague. They're both atheists, and they both conclude that God must exist.
Fred Hoyle was very frustrating to the evolutionists because he was one, and yet he followed the evidence where it led. And that's what we should do as well. Follow the evidence where it leads. And if it leads to a metaphysical answer, we shouldn't throw it out, because the metaphysical answer is therefore the correct answer.
If there really was a worldwide flood, what would the evidence be? Billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down the water all over the earth. Billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. Well, there really was a world